2 weeks ago, the founder of the National Liberty Museum, Herb Borowski, passed away. He was a good friend of FPRI, and I think we will always miss him, but we will never forget him. And may his memory be a blessing. So let us just take one moment of silence in memory of Herb Borowski. Thank you. So we'll begin tonight. We're very happy to be back at the National Liberty Museum for our last program of the year. We'll be back here in February and then proceeding from there. This is not the last program of the year for us. We're at our mainline breakfast briefings tomorrow at the Philadelphia Country Club at 7:30 a.m. So if you're awake, that's where we are. Our speaker tonight is Ambassador Stephen Sestanovich. He is the George F. Kennan Senior Fellow for Russian and Eurasian Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations. That's a bit daunting to be the George Kennan Fellow, I must say. And the Catherine and Shelby Cullen Davis Professor of International Diplomacy at Columbia University. He has served in executive positions at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, the Center for Strategic and International Studies, so he's had his hand in many think tanks. He's also served as ambassador at large for the former Soviet Union during the period 1997 to 2001, staff member of the National Security Council, a staff member of the Office of Policy Planning in the State Department. And he has written frequently for all the important venues, the Washington Post, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal. And he now has a new book called Maximalist, America and the World from Truman to Obama. I took a good part of today to read this book, and it's really a great read. So I recommend it to you. It's for sale at the reception desk as you entered the museum. So with that, let me introduce Dr. Stephen Sestanovich.
Thank you very much. Thanks to all of you for coming out on a miserable evening. I have the feeling it wasn't quite as miserable here as it was in New York, but it's probably a pretty close run thing. Yes, daunting to be the George Kennan Fellow, but I think daunting to be the Catherine and Shelby Cullum Davis Professor, too. And I was talking earlier to friends of the Davis family. A great connection to have, one that I'm proud of. Before turning to the question of the evening, I do want to say one word about organizations like this. And by that I mean FPRI, also the National Liberty Museum. In the course of my government work in particular, I've dealt with a lot of countries that do not have significant institutions outside the capital, do not have major universities, do not have non-governmental organizations devoted to any kind of independent activity, do not have anything that we often call civil society, and I think they're much the poorer for it. The stability and balance that our intellectual life has, and our cultural life, and our political life too, is in many respects the function of having so many centers of this kind of activity, and countries that don't have it are marked, are very different for that reason. I want to talk about the topic of my book, the role of the United States in the world, which this year has again become one of the most pressing and contentious issues of American politics and of American political debate. That's the result of a series of global shocks Suddenly there's a whole raft of issues that preoccupy the administration, preoccupy the Congress, preoccupy the punditocracy. People are debating all manner of issues. You know, it started with Ukraine, then ISIS drove it off the front pages, Ebola, but even some of the lingering issues that are, you know, not quite so dramatic, nevertheless pose a lot of questions for the United States, China, you name it. There is a resurgence of foreign policy questions that the administration did not expect to have to deal with, and a surge of debate. To evoke the way in which the United States generally carries on such debates in response to shocks, I'd like to read a passage from George Kennan's diaries in which he describes the response in Washington to the Korean invasion in 1950. He said, people were buzzing and milling around, each with his own idea of what we were trying to do. He compared this buzzing to what you get when you throw a stone into a beehive. A wild buzzing that ends up with a lot of people getting stung. He said there was utter confusion in the public mind with respect to U.S. foreign policy. The president doesn't understand it, Congress doesn't understand it, nor does the public, nor does the press. They all wander around in a labyrinth of ignorance and error and conjecture, in which truth is intermingled with fiction at 100 points, in which unjustified assumptions have attained the validity of premises, and in which there is no recognized and authoritative theory to hold on to. It sounds like us, right? What Kennan meant, of course, was nobody is listening to me. But it's the way in which we're now debating a lot of these big issues. For the administration, I think this seems like bad luck. But I want to argue that it isn't just an unexpected series or convergence of new problems, that we can understand the debate we're having now better by seeing it in the context of debates in the past. And that's where my book comes in. What Maximalist tries to do is to make the past usable, more usable for us than we've tended to think in a while. I believe we have a kind of distance from the past because it seems as though for decades and decades the United States was successful in the world with a foreign policy consensus. You've heard this mythology: bipartisanship, cooperation with allies, continuity from one administration to the next. That's how we won the Cold War, remember? We stuck to the same strategy over many decades. Now, my view is this is much too reverential a view of how we actually conducted ourselves in the past. The reality is that American foreign policy has been confused, chaotic, disorganized, full of discord internally, with allies, changing from administration to administration. A picture of the past that we can be comforted by because it's really very much like the situation that we confront. And I tell the story of American foreign policy since Truman in these terms, with each president, for example, coming in and thinking that his predecessor was full of it, on the wrong track, not understanding the world, making mistake after mistake, and in need of a new direction. That's what Truman thought of Roosevelt, it's what Eisenhower thought of Truman, it's what Kennedy thought of Eisenhower. You get the idea. However, I don't want to say that history, this history that I tell, is just one damn thing after another, to cite a famous definition of history. I try to organize, here's the political scientist coming in, by saying that actually America operates in two modes in the world. What I call a mode of the maximalist mode, which is what we do in response to new challenges, shocks, when we conclude that the right answer is think big, pedal to the metal, do more. Status quo is unacceptable, unsustainable. The other mode, maximalism is what follows under commitment. When we look around and see, oh, we haven't been doing enough, we need to do more. The other mode is retrenchment. Maximalism is the policy party. Retrenchment is the policy hangover. We elect a president who promises to clean up the previous messes. And his views tend to be, the motto of retrenchment is do less, think harder, put on the brakes, go slower, not faster. And you can see how the major, big episodes in the Cold War match up with maximalism. The activism of the 1940s, trying to organize the world so as to restabilize it in the wake of, or in the face of a kind of Soviet challenge, but also the pulling back after things get out of hand. I want to give you the quick code, or the decoder for when we're in a maximalist decade and when we're in a maximalist period and when in a retrenchment. The answer is, and I didn't put this in the book, Alan, you can read all the way to the end and you won't find it because it seems too simple-minded, is maximalist decades are even-numbered ones. You see, this is why I didn't put it in the book. Retrenchment decades are odd-numbered ones. 40s, 60s, 80s, 2000s, maximalist. 50s, 70s, 90s, it's complicated. 2000 teens, odd, and those are retrenchment decades. Now, I want to say a little bit more about what the characteristics of retrenchment and maximalism are, but first, one thing about why you end up with this alternation. Why do we do one and then the other in this incredibly regular way? Well, the answer is we overdo it. Maximalists overdo it on the high side. They do too much, make a mess, create a disaster that leads the American people to say, hold on, we're hiring somebody else. And they bring in a president who will be committed to retrenchment. Retrenchers overdo it on the low side. They are thought not to be responding to new challenges. We'll come to that. But it's because of the inability to avoid overdoing it that you end up with one and then the other. Believe me, or rather don't believe me, just listen. I want to say a little more fully about how maximalism works, how retrenchment works, ask whether we should expect this cyclical alternation to continue. After all, eventually we're going to get to an even-numbered decade again, and you are entitled to know whether we're going to be back in maximalist mode. And then a question that I often get asked, which is better? maximalism or retrenchment? From what I've said, you may already know the answer. Quickly then, about sort of 6 key attributes of both maximalism and retrenchment. First, about maximalism. It emerges in an atmosphere of crisis and emergency. There's not enough being done. The president wants to have a broader package of measures, and he implements it. Second, it reflects a conviction that the American people have a short attention span. They can't be expected to endorse a big program for a long time. That's why it's got to be even bigger. General Marshall, for example, in telling people how to put together the Marshall Plan, said it can only last 3 or 4 years. That's as much as the American people will tolerate. So get everything done that we need to get done. Third, maximalist policies reflect a kind of conviction that others are not going to be able to contribute very much. Our good allies, you know, come on. That's not what maximalists count on. They're thought to be weak, parochial, disorganized, not up to it. For this, I will give you a sort of the paradigmatic statement of maximalist views of other countries, John Connolly, who said, I think this was a congressional hearing of some sort, he said, ladies and gentlemen, the foreigners are trying to screw us. And his strategy, he said, was, I intend to screw them first. Fourth attribute of maximalism, a doubt that international mechanisms, multilateral institutions will actually be adequate to significant problem solving. Here, instead of John Connolly, I will quote Hillary Clinton, who said after the 2009 Copenhagen Conference on Climate Change, which not all of you remember, she said, I haven't seen anything so badly run since my 8th grade student council. That, you know, American presidents actually tend to be rather skeptical of what international organizations can do, unless, this I think was what Hillary Clinton would have said, unless led by the United States. Fifth attribute of maximalist policies, the idea that halfway measures won't suffice. That you undertake a halfway measure and you then get a halfway solution. And halfway solutions won't be ones that America can make work over the long term. Why? Short attention span, there we go. Attribute number 2. Americans are unhappy with gray zones. You know, Dean Acheson, in the debate about whether the United States had to go north in the Korean War, said he didn't see how this was going to last if you just restored the status quo ante, because then people would lose interest and the North would take over again. Finally, maximalism is often the result of guilty consciences. A guilty conscience based on a realization that you weren't doing enough before the threat materialized. You kind of knew that it was there, but you weren't responding to it. I would say Harry Truman in the Korean War, Lyndon Johnson in the Vietnam War, George Bush after September 11th, all had in the back of their minds, I knew something was happening and I didn't do enough to stop it. I think this outlook is imprinted in our DNA, as foreign policy specialists like to say. I don't like that phrase very much myself, but I think it is powerful, not just in maximalist periods, but in all periods. Even in retrenchment, there's a maximalist tug, and we'll come back to that. Now, 6 attributes of retrenchment. Retrenchment is not isolationism. And I am always trying to correct people on this. We have no real isolationism in American political debate, with one tiny exception. And that is, in the party that is responsible for the previous mess, they're often, the mess in the even-numbered decades, in the odd-numbered decades, there will be a small part of that party that becomes isolationist. So I say there are McGovernite Democrats in the 70s and McGovernite Republicans in the 20-teens who are isolationists. Instead, what retrenchment presidents propose is not to give up on the world, but to find a sustainable policy. Sustainable is the favorite word of retrenchment presidents. I didn't know this before I started writing this book. They want to come up with a policy for the long haul, another favorite phrase of them. They don't think you can beat the short attention span problem. They think you can. Or rather, put it another way. They don't think you can beat it by having big efforts, but you can beat it by having long-term sustainable policies. To do that, though, they think you have to downplay ideology. Ideology tends to produce craziness, is what retrenchment presidents think. Second attribute, retrenchment policies are presidentially controlled. The White House is in charge. That was true under Eisenhower, more true than it had been under Truman, true under Nixon, much truer than under Kennedy or Johnson, true under Obama, more true than under George Bush. Retrenchment presidents are centralizers. Although there's a little bit, retrenchment tends to be when Congress comes out of hibernation and tries to assert its role. Third attribute of retrenchment presidents, they're popular. They get reelected. Eisenhower, Nixon, Obama, resoundingly elected to second terms. But, here's the fourth attribute. They end up with problems after they've cleaned up the mess they were hired to deal with. The American people bring them in. They say, there's the Korean War, there's the Vietnam War, there's the Iraq War, please deal with this. And when they deal with it, then they discover that there are new challenges. That things pop up, ISIS, Ukraine, Ebola, that weren't part of their theory of the case. And in fact, they're kind of irritated. Then they deny that these are real problems. They say, you know, we can't just go chasing after all these problems, as you call them, that arise. Retrenchment presidents are irritable presidents. I mean, they get annoyed by this challenge. You know, people ask them, well, what are you doing about this? And their answer is essentially, well, I'm sorry, I fixed the mess. That produces a debate, and we'll come back to that. First, it produces disorientation. Retrenchment presidents get disoriented because they don't see that the strong support they had in the center for the policies that they developed are disappearing. They tend to think these critiques come from the margins. They actually are losing support even within their own administrations. And finally, the sixth attribute of retrenchment presidents is they're inarticulate. They exercise poor rhetorical leadership. You might say, when I say this to people, they say, Barack Obama exercises poor rhetorical leadership? But actually they say, what? They're puzzled by it because they know that actually on foreign policy he hasn't been able to articulate things very well, even though he's a gifted speaker. How can this be? Well, go back to understand this and think about our other retrenchment presidents in the 50s, 70s, and 90s. Eisenhower, Nixon, Ford, Carter, George H.W. Bush. There you're talking serious inarticulateness. But I think that might be a kind of clue to why Barack Obama is inarticulate about retrenchment and about foreign policy. It's because retrenchment is a downer. It's hard to be inspiring about doing less, about the long haul, about sustainability. Welcome to the club, Barack Obama. This is a tough assignment. Now, I said I was going to talk a little bit about whether this analysis suggests that there's another cycle coming. I mean, we've had 70 years of cycles, right? Why would they not continue? I won't predict that we will have another cycle, but I will predict at least a debate. But one whose results I think we can't be sure of. And the reason for that is there are a lot of pressures that are bearing down on American foreign policy that make people say, we have really got to avoid going back to that over-involvement in the world, to that maximalist, they don't use the word because they haven't read my book, but to that excess activism. Maybe, they say, we just need to scale back at long last. The American economy represents a smaller part of the world economy than it has in the past. Public opinion, we see, is less enthusiastic about foreign policy activism. There's elite uncertainty. The foreign policy establishment has kind of lost its enthusiasm for maximalism. And the international environment seems uniquely complicated and maybe not susceptible to American solutions in the way that it was in the past. And I think all of those factors may produce a more protracted retrenchment than in the past. At least that's what some people say. And I think that's worth listening to those arguments. But I would point out to you that all of those things were said in the course of previous retrenchments. Retrenchment debates are always about exactly those things. And we have in the 50s and in the 70s and the 90s said all of those things. That the American economy was smaller, that the public didn't want it, that the foreign policy elite had lost its enthusiasm, that the world was more complicated now. And even so, we turned back in a maximalist direction. I don't think this means we will necessarily do that again, but I think one should be sobered by the awareness, which you will learn about if you read the discussion of the previous retrenchments. Retrenchment debates are terrific. They are very lively. They're more interesting, really, than the debates that happened during maximalist periods. Because everything is on the table. We're arguing from first principles, and we're going to be over the foreseeable future. Retrenchments tend to be pretty, I know it'll seem odd to say this when I've said that they're all, about a decade, but the maximalist periods are the short decades, and the retrenchment ones are often a little bit longer. I mean, that's complicated, and we can talk about dating if you want, but that's not what I want to do now. I want to say that what happens in retrenchment debates is that both parties get divided. There is a real willingness within each party, even despite their previous alignments, to think about flipping in a different direction. So that we're going to have a debate in both the Republican and Democratic parties as to what the future direction of foreign policy should be. And I don't think there's any telling who's going to prevail in each party. I think you can plausibly make the argument that you will get a retrenchment Republican and a maximalist Democrat, or a maximalist Republican and a retrenchment Democrat, or 2 retrenchers and 2 maximalists. And I'm using these terms loosely because nobody's going to say I'm a maximalist. That sounds a little bit crazy. And nobody's going to say I'm just for retrenchment because it sounds a little bit too depressing. But we'll be able to tell which one is which. And I think it's going to be a fabulous debate. You can already see how lively it is. A last comment, which is, I mean, since we're going to have a debate, we might as well know which is the good one, right? Don't you want to know which one to pick? I think it's not the right question. Because, as I said, both of these approaches tend to be overdone. It is hard to pick a favorite when you've got a record in which both kinds of strategies, both strategic outlooks have led to screw-ups. Yes, American foreign policy from Truman to Obama is a period of enormous achievement and creativity, and that has produced the American foreign policy decade after decade with enormous opportunities and to which other countries repeatedly turn for solutions. And yet, there's also been excess and failure. And digging into American foreign policy shows you how hard it is to draw the line between good policy and overdoing it. So I have an even-handed answer about this, which is that we need to learn from both retrenchment and maximalism. We need to learn from retrenchers that, in fact, there are some problems we shouldn't try to solve. But we need to learn from maximalists that there are problems we absolutely do have to solve, and that to solve them, we need to make a significant effort. From retrenchers, we need to learn the importance of priorities. From maximalists, the importance of avoiding paralysis. The problem is priorities often lead to paralysis. So these are hard to reconcile. I've grown skeptical in a way that I didn't start exactly in writing the book of the idea of good policy for all seasons. I think continuity is one of the most overrated pseudo-virtues of American foreign policy. We tend to think that the great achievement of American foreign policy is continuity. I think it's a discontinuity. We know when to change course. To my mind, people who are convinced and are advertising that they have identified a policy that's good decade after decade, and I'm happy to have a discussion about any and all of this, and to sign the books when you buy them. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let me just make one correction for the record as a former student of the Eisenhower presidency. Eisenhower was only inarticulate when he didn't want anyone to know what he was really thinking. Let me also correct...
we can have a debate about that. I'm not sure I would agree with that.
Let me also correct one omission. This is the last lecture for the year in our Ginsburg lecture series, so please thank Stan Ginsburg. And now we'll turn to Q&A. If you have a question, raise your hand. Eli will bring you the microphone. Speak directly into the microphone.
Thank you, sir. Question about your ambassadorship.
Oh, yeah.
You're supposed to be the representative of the president. How does that system really work?
Well, how much money have you got? Sorry.
I see.
I asked that question with it's a joking reference to my confirmation hearings because, which senator was it? Oh, it was Senator Sarbanes. Said to me, he wanted to know whom I'd called What he meant was whom I'd called to contribute to. He thought, you know, an ambassador who was not a professional was bound to be somebody who had made a large contribution to the Clinton campaign. I had the title ambassador at large because Jesse Helms did not want me to have the title Assistant Secretary for Post-Soviet Eurasian and East European Affairs is what we're going to call it. Because he thought, I mean, here's a short answer to your question. It works with the cooperation or non-cooperation of the Congress and the President of the United States. He thought that if there were an ambassador who was responsible at the State Department, or an assistant secretary responsible for the former Soviet Union, that would perpetuate the Soviet Union. I tried to explain this. You know, the Soviet Union was really defunct, but that did not persuade him. You know, the way, I mean, your question about how ambassadorships work could mean a lot of different things. And I'm thinking that my next book will be about diplomacy, so we might take up this question. But, you know, one of the things that is quite bizarre about the way American foreign policy is conducted is that, and this does include me, is we bring in, even though I'm not a big contributor, we bring in outsiders to take part in it. I'm a Washington in and outer, mostly from, you know, universities and think tanks, and then in government. But we bring these people in, and we give them responsibilities, and then we say, you know, just do it. Learn on the job. Implement your big, fancy ideas. And then we throw them out when in the next election, and maybe they come back or maybe they don't. There's no other country that I know of that does that conducts its foreign policy this way, much less bringing in big contributors. I mean, it's really a crazy system from the standpoint of any other country in the world. But, you know, it kind of works. And it does create a reservoir of people outside the government who know how the government works, and it creates a group of people inside the government who are aware of what the government looks like from the outside. And that's something that no other government, no other system has. As many people who are really aware of how hard it is to make decisions on the inside, and people who are on the inside knowing how stupid you can look from the outside. So I tend to think that's not a bad system, but it only works because we don't do it 100% that way. We have to have our really fabulous professionals who are kind of steadying the course and trying to teach the, you know, the new kids on the block how things are really done.
Ambassador, you say both sides. Maximalists overdo it, retrenchers overdo it.
Overdo the underdoing.
And you end up with a big cycle of going back and forth, screwing it up, solving the problem, screwing it up.
Right.
Everybody will know that after they read your book.
Right.
So what do you suggest to solve the problem and get them, both sides, to throttle back and don't go as far as they used to go?
Well, it's a great idea. You know, I mean, people read the book and they think that, but I think or rather they hear about the book and they think that. But I think if they read the book, they have a little more of an appreciation of how difficult it is to actually thread that, that middle course. Partly it's that presidents become convinced that they have solved the problem. and for political reasons, they are reluctant to acknowledge that there are difficulties that they didn't envision and that they need new policies for. It is that's a certain part of the difficulty, and I don't. If you've got an idea for how to convince presidents that they don't have all the answers, I'm willing to hear that, but I'm skeptical. I think our system works better by empowering people to, take over and do what they can. The other thing that makes it hard to assume that you can just find a middle way is the shock of crises. People, for the maximalist reasons that I describe, believe that when you have a new challenge, you've got to figure out how to wrestle it to the ground completely. Remember what George Marshall, I quote him a lot because I think people don't appreciate the way in which the 40s did shape this, this outlook. Marshall said in his Harvard speech about the Marshall Plan, he said, "We're not looking for a palliative. We're looking for a cure. We want it done. We don't think we can operate with just bumping along and what I call the long haul approach. Sure, over the long haul we might come out okay, but I think that view has never really taken hold in an atmosphere of crisis. It's only after we've overdone it that people are prepared to say, "Oh yeah, that's good. That's good." That's why academic realists they tend to be advocates of a steady, long-haul approach. They tend to come into their own after a big mess. But in an atmosphere of crisis, presidents want a solution for all the reasons that I mentioned that I think are not only powerful reasons that American presidents believe in, but a lot of it is true. Can you really count on other countries to step up to contribute to solutions? So far, the experience of most presidents is they let you down. If you want to solve something, send the United States. Free rider, academics analyze this. They're free rider problems. What are you going to do about free rider problems? Well, there are two things you can do. You can do less and sort of force others to do more. Or you can say, well, the United States free rider problems be damned, the United States is going to have to pick up the slack and lead. And that produces overcommitment. We bite off more than we can chew. But it also gets you, big approaches that actually do solve problems. So I think I like the idea. I just want to warn you. There's no record of this being successful in the real world. So, Alan, do you want me to recognize people? Okay.
I wonder whether your idea of maximalist and what I will call minimalist is really something that's more applicable. It's applicable not only to the situation you describe of foreign affairs, but perhaps also to domestic affairs. That is, whether the same kind of thing applies, and we could look at social reform, where the government might spend $1 trillion in a decade to make the country better in some way, and then the next decade they may say, well, that really didn't work out too well, so let's do something else or do nothing. But I wonder even further, than applying it to domestic situation, whether it's just an American characteristic. It's a little analogous to a drunk who walks down the road and stumbles into the ditch on the right.
You mean this in a good way, right?
Yes,
yeah.
And then stumbles into the ditch on the left, but never can walk down the middle. And it's totally different than the British idea, which is very un-American, I think, of all we need to do is muddle through.
Yeah.
That doesn't show leadership, direction, aspirational goals. We're just going to muddle through. I wonder whether you'd comment on that.
You know, I have found people telling me that, you know, well, you see these patterns in other periods, in other realms of politics, and I think that might be right. I think it is certainly true that if you're talking about crises that are recognized as having the same dimensions as threats to national survival, that you will get people talking about big solutions. So the Depression produces a kind of crystallizing new model of American politics and of the role of the government in society. You get in the 60s, you know, Lyndon Johnson, you could say, has a kind of maximalist conception of what government can do to solve problems of poverty. And there are, you know, there are other examples, and even though it involves reducing the role of government, you could probably see the Reagan Revolution having some of those attributes too. We got to do something really big in order to solve the blockages in American politics. I think you don't have it in general as much in domestic politics as in foreign policy because there are not as many problems that seem to threaten national survival in the same way as foreign policy problems do. And because American domestic politics is more the realm of lots and lots of participants and balancing each other and checking each other. American foreign policy is the realm of presidential initiative and control, and that makes it possible to push forward maximalist solutions. So I like your idea that some of this is rooted in the American character. I think in domestic politics there tend to be checks on maximalist solutions. In foreign policy, there are fewer checks. But you're right, some of the same categories and mistakes are visible in these other areas. And you've reminded me of, you know, of some of those phrases for describing, you know, kind of do-nothing diplomacy, muddling through. One of my favorites is masterly inactivity, and that's another, you know, that's a kind of retrenchment diplomacy.
Here I am. Okay, so that's the U.S. picture over the last 60 years or so.
Over the last 67 years is when we started in 1947. Go ahead.
I stand correct.
Yeah.
Thank you. What about other countries and their policies? Are other countries in a similar sort of back and forth, or is there somebody who's doing it better?
I think it is actually rather distinctively American because we have less agreement about what it is that the role of the United States in the world ought to be. It's less dictated by circumstances. If you're a small country surrounded by enemies, just to take an extreme case, it's pretty obvious what your foreign policy is going to be. Fight the enemies, or at least find friends, create balances against them. You know, you have some options, but you've got a definition of your task, which is, you know, security narrowly understood. The United States, by virtue of its enormous power, by virtue of its, you know, limitless and universal ideas, its sort of global presence, is inclined and now habituated to think that we can play a fundamental and world-transforming role until we decide we don't like that and that we have to do something different. So I think the bands of possible debate, the ways in which you can conceivably increase the role of the United States and decrease it are wider than for most countries. Other countries tend to be a little more constrained by their capabilities, by their circumstances. You know, if you want to kind of pile on a little bit here, by their less messianic conception of what God put them on earth to do. And I say this in a, really in a kind of neutral and detached way. This is just how Americans operate, and it has really great and really sort of messy consequences.
Yeah, when you were doing the research for your book, how
Yeah.
did you balance discerning structural patterns and actually analyzing the individual psychology of the presidents?
Oh, yeah. Good, very good. Some of it is obviously structure. In the 1940s, no other power had the opportunity to play the role that the United States was called on to play, as we thought of it at the time, because it was the only economy that had survived the war, it had the resources, the mobilizable military resources to stand against the Soviet threat. It had that's sort of the main structural question. Everybody else is devastated. But you still had room for individuals to play a part, and you had a margin of choice for the United States. And to give you an example of individuals, I like to, got some baseball fans in the room, I like to use the metric of wins above replacement for American presidents. I would say in the 1947 season, Harry Truman's wins above replacement, you know what wins above replacement is? Wins above replacement is what baseball fans, baseball sabermetricians, measure as the value of a player compared to an average player. How much does the star contribute compared to the journeyman second baseman? How much does that really great second baseman that you have, by virtue of his fabulous fielding, hitting and so forth, how much does he contribute? How many wins? In 1947, the Marshall Plan actually is pretty much the result of a consensus. Any president, I think, would probably have settled on the Marshall Plan, the Truman Doctrine. The policies of the United States in 1947 were pretty much agreed within the foreign policy establishment. Sorry? Well, Henry Wallace is a slightly different case, yeah, but I'm not sure that Henry Wallace would have stood against the consensus if he had been president. So here, Professor Joe Nye, one of my former advisors, has written a book in which he says, suppose Henry Wallace had been president. Well, who knows what Henry Wallace would have believed in 1947 with the world doing what it was. In 1948, though, I believe Harry Truman's wins above replacement score was astronomical because in 1948, the American military wanted to pull out of Berlin, whereas Harry Truman wanted to have the airlift to keep Stalin from seizing West Berlin. American diplomats said, Berlin, Stalin isn't as big a threat as you think. Those were the Soviet specialists. And other countries were saying, you want to have a war with the Soviet Union over Berlin? That was the French view, So Harry Truman said, no, I don't want to have a war, but I am going to stop Stalin from driving us out of Berlin. And he overruled all kinds of people. Fabulous wins above replacement score there. There's your star second baseman. And I don't want to go on and do this with lots of other presidents, but their structure doesn't tell you what you're going to do. It's a president who has a conviction about it. And I would say that, you can apply that wins above replacement to a lot of presidents, although it's often hard to come up with the answer. After 2001, almost any president would have had a big maximalist policy in response to September 11th. But, in 2002 and 2003, it was still a choice about whether or not Iraq was going to be part of that.
Time for one last question.
Yeah, I was going to I was going to ask the converse question of that. Who or where were the worst wrong turns made? If you're citing Truman standing in Berlin,
Yeah.
as the, and does that fall on one side of that margin or the other?
Yeah, sometimes.
Retrenchment or.
Good, good. I think sometimes people exaggerate the role of individuals. For example, a lot of people, maybe you read David Halberstam's book on Korea, came out a few years ago. It's all about how MacArthur was the devil and led to the invasion of North Korea. Totally wrong. Everybody was in favor of going north in Korea. And, you know, how it was done was pretty, you know, significant, and it was a big mess. But it was a kind of maximalist consensus mess. It would have been great if there had been a way found to limit the American involvement, to try to, maybe it would have been impossible to keep the Chinese from coming in, but to make it less disastrous when they did, so we weren't so vulnerable. But that was a horrendous mess. Vietnam War, horrendous mess. But largely a consensus maximalist view. I mean, mess. I argue in the book that Lyndon Johnson was the one person who was really fighting hard to stay out of the war. We tend to think of Johnson as just a monster. This was really a consensus policy of the American foreign policy establishment. It was maximal, the entire elite kind of jumping off the cliff there. There were ways it could have been done better and worse, but it was a pretty big mess. I think these maximalist messes are they're the mistakes on the high side, but it's interesting to see the errors on the downside, where retrenchment sort of makes you want to do less, even though you've kind of lost the argument about it. And I'll give you two examples. One, somebody we all admire, and one whom we all kind of don't admire. Dwight Eisenhower, when Khrushchev put pressure on Berlin in the late 50s, had what idea? Anybody know? It's a way of responding. People were panicked by the Berlin crisis. You know, what, this is going to be a war again? Oh, no. Let's take troops out of Germany. We need to cut the troops in Germany. People said, well, what are you talking about? And he said, well, they said, that will make war more likely. And he said, nah, I'm the man who launched D-Day. I know that we're not going to have any war. I can threaten the Soviets and it'll be fine. But Eisenhower's kind of committed to retrenchment in a way that led him to sort of have goofy ideas of that kind. Carter, in 1980, where after the invasion of Afghanistan, was really being pushed in a maximalist direction. And yet he couldn't quite convince himself that that's what he was doing. And so he's always kind of secretly trying to send signals to and emissaries to the Soviets to try to find a way to solve the problems, get a deal in Afghanistan. There you needed a kind of greater clarity about what the threat was and a greater consistency. Most of his cabinet members were horrified that this is the way Carter thought about things. But it was a kind of retrenchment outlook pushing him, I think, in a way that he found hard to resist, even though the moment no longer seemed to allow retrenchment. It was calling for maximalism. Alan.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.